What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video. And this week it's really not a deck tech, it's on the normal day and mainly with some other factors going on in life and all that fun, great, happy stuff. I decided that I was going to do something new until we had some kind of shakeup happen to the modern format. So rather than going over, say, a new deck or maybe something that's been popping up in the format, I'm going to be going over some of the most popular decks that are played in the format and kind of going from the perspective of the player playing the deck and then the person playing against the deck. We won't be going over into very specific matchups and going through every possible matchup in the modern format because that would be a lot to go over in one video. But hopefully, this will be some tips and tricks and other sort of things to help you not only play this deck better or learn some things pretty quickly and things that you can work on if you are deciding to pick up the deck or currently playing the deck. And hopefully, if you're on the other side of it, this helps you kind of understand the mindset of like the player playing the deck and just figuring out your own way and figuring out some easy keys to remember when approaching matchups such as this. So, without further ado, and with all that great rambling out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the most popular deck currently played in the modern format according to FTG Goldfish from the past month, and it's probably been the most played deck for months, period. And there'll be a good reason when we actually look at the deck list and we get into it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at Blue-Red Murktide for the modern format. So here we have Murktide deck. This list in particular is piloted by Notorious, who actually won the Modern Challenge on September 11th, 2022. And essentially, instead of this being a deck tech and necessarily breaking down things as we go over card by card, this will be kind of a way that we explain like some of the numbers and stuff like that that we might see out of this deck. So the big thing about like the Murktide deck, if you have played it or played against it or understand anything about like the blue-red archetype in general, is a lot of it is tempo based, and you'll notice just straight out from the threats. You have Dragon Rage Chandler, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, and a Ledger Shredder. The theme with these threats, and including Murktide as well, uh, Dragon Rage Channeler and Ragavan both come down turn one. Dragon Rage Channeler triggering the Surveil whenever you cast a non-creature spell, which when you pair it with cards like Mishra's Bauble, you're able to kind of dig through your deck, find another one of your like 19 lands that you have to hit multiple land drops and just continue like cantripping on through your deck. It also directly feeds into the Murktide regents that you play in the deck to make them as big as possible. You'll generally see like 2 to 3 copies. I don't think there's very many people playing for Dragon Rage Channeler, so normally once you get past the first and the second one, you are very unlikely to see the third one, but you more than likely won't see more than four unless someone's like shuffling around different numbers and stuff with like Ledger Shredders and Ragavans. Speaking of Ragavans, assuming that budget is not a concern, you are always going to see 4 Ragavan from the Murktide deck. This is the best one drop that you can play in the format. It is definitely the most powerful. There's a reason why they call it Deathrite Shaman 2.0, and people still think Deathrite Shaman is too good for the format. Ragavan is just amazing, and you definitely need to be playing 4 of them if you are playing the deck, and you need to be prepared to see 4 of them from your opponent. Obviously, in multiples, these cards is not great because it is a legendary creature, but this on turn one, after that, the Murktide deck does a very good job of being able to protect it, and then obviously get a mana advantage on top of just getting to potentially cast spells from your opponent's library. So definitely be prepared for Ragavan. Uh, in the last 2 creatures, Ledger Shredder and Murktide Regent, Ledger Shredder is definitely a card that I think of the threats as in terms of like immediate impact is not as great. Dragon Rage Channeler, you're able to immediately on turn one, if you have a Mishra's Bauble, start triggering it, churning through your deck, filling your graveyard for your Murktide Regents, and getting to Delirium on your Unholy Heats, and even for your future Dragon Rage Channelers. But Ledger Shredder, playing this on turn 2 and then getting to follow up with Mishra's Bauble, can immediately make it into a 2/4. The Mishra's Bauble will replace itself with a card, and from there, you're able to just get in with it with a 2-power flyer, and then cast multiple spells on your opponent's turn, and even punish your opponent for playing multiple spells on their turn as well, especially if they're trying to get rid of the Ledger Shredder. 3 copies to me might be okay. I'm kind of partial to playing like 4 of this card. Like if you're going to play another 4 of threat in the deck, I think you play like Ragavan. Murktide Regent is a card that's kind of hard for me to play 4 copies of. Even though you want to see it, you definitely aren't going to be able to play 4 full copies of this card and reliably get it to 8 power when you play it. So I would definitely think that you'd want 4 Ledger Shredder just for the fact that this threat just keeps churning through your deck, keeps drawing you cards, punishes your opponent for playing multiple spells in a turn, and rewarding you essentially for playing multiple spells in a turn. And feeling like the delirium cards that you have in the deck, on top of also fueling future Murktide Regents and getting cards that are out of your hand that aren't really doing anything, and fueling them for your other spells and things like that. So roughly these are the numbers that you'll probably see. You might see like 4 Dragon Rage Chandler, 4 Ledger Shredder, but realistically, like you can expect 4 Ragavan and more than 2 Murktide Regent. 3 is probably the perfect number. I'm sure there's some mad people playing 4, but that's just what it is. Cards in the main deck, Consider and Unholy Heat are probably your best 1 mana cards in this deck. Obviously, there's a reason why, because you don't play 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Spell Pierce, and 4 Spell Snare. Consider essentially can put 2 cards into your graveyard. One from the one that you look on top. If it's what you want, great, you just draw that card. If not, or you just want to have more spells in the graveyard from Murktide Regent, pitch it, draw another card. This kind of gives you a bunch of utility. Obviously, paired with like Dragon Rage Channeler as well, you can see up to 3 cards if you have a Dragon Rage Channeler, which is pretty good. Also, just being cheap, again, just kind of like fueling the delirium side of your cards while also setting up Murktide Regents is very good, and a reason why you can expect 4 copies of this card. On top of that, Unholy Heat, just getting to deal 6 damage for 1 mana, kills a lot of the creatures in the format. Anything short of having a Colossus Hammer thrown on it or some really big Urza Saga construct tokens, Unholy Heat's going to take care of like 95% of the threats in the format. Of course, forgetting that on the other side of the table, you could be facing down an 88 Murktide region. Unholy Heat plus some combat slash other spells in the deck can deal with those. So Unholy Heat, your best bang for your buck in terms of removal, so you can definitely expect 4 of those in the deck. Other 4 being like Counterspell. Counterspell is the most efficient way to counter spells. Just straight up 2 blue mana, as old as time, counter whatever spell you want. Definitely good to kind of match the tempo strategy that this deck kind of wants to be in, where it gets to play a bunch of cheap spells, gain value from playing those cheap spells, and like 1-for-1 your opponent super hard. Even though 1-for-1 should sound like a very straightforward exchange, I spend a card to deal with your 1 card. There's definitely a hidden impact meter, if you will, in those exchanges where, if you counterspell your opponent's biggest threat or a card that they really wanted to resolve, that's huge for you in a 1-for-1 scenario. You definitely don't want to get in those scenarios where you counter a spell or you kill a creature that your opponent really didn't care about or really wasn't impacting the board or is going to impact the game, to then be completely blown out by a creature or another spell that is going to absolutely impact the game. So things to keep in mind. Reason why we play another 4 counter spells in this deck, because between like your mana base and what you're able to do to get ahead on mana, 2 mana for counter spell is very good. You also have Expressive Iteration, easily the best cantrip in the format, and probably one of the best cantrips that's legal in Modern and will probably ever be legal in Modern. The amount of card selection you get by looking at the top 3 cards, you get 1 in your hand, which could be like a Murktide or like a Ledger Shredder, things like that, and then you just getting to possibly hit a land drop off of this or a Mishra's Bauble for free if you cast this on turn 2, and then any turn after where you have available mana is just going to be big game as well. So definitely something to keep in mind, that you are going to see 4 of this card, and chances are Expressive Iterations could just find other Expressive Iterations to cantrip and make a bigger impact on later turns. Rounding out some of the other spells, like Lightning Bolt, I know is kind of a card that like fluctuates in numbers. Spell Pierce the same way. Spell Snare is probably a solid one of, maybe you won't see it, maybe you will. Just definitely kind of on that cusp, but definitely would expect it more than not. Archmage's Charm, having the same modes as Counterspell, but then allowing a player to draw 2 cards and gain control of permanent current mana cost 1 or less. You can definitely steal some very powerful creatures, like your Archmage's Charm can steal even your opponent's like Ragavan or Dragon Rage Channeler, steal some Rhino tokens and things like that. Definitely a card that you don't want to play a whole lot of. 2 copies is perfect, just because triple blue might not necessarily be hard for the deck to cast, but definitely is very color intensive. But all the modes and things like that are all relevant in the format and can definitely help you gain some much needed card advantage when you're really running low on resources from one for winning your opponent. So that's always great. Mission Bauble, literally the freest card that you can play in Modern. Paired with Dragon Rage Channeler, you can definitely loot through your deck a lot. Same with like Ledger Shredder, you play Ledger Shredder on turn 2. Uh, it's a free card. I mean, this is a card that people have said that should have been played a lot sooner, given the fact that it was originally printed in Cold Snap. But it was not played all that much until we really saw it played in like some Grixis pile that like Patrick Chapin played like years and years ago. And since then, like Death Shadow and now Murktide Region has picked it up and seen great success with it. Um, so now that we kind of ran through like the spells, the creatures, and kind of like the frequency that you would see these in, as the Murktide player, the biggest thing that you're looking for is trying to absolutely tempo out your opponent. You want to play one of your cheap threats early, turn 1 or turn 2. Preferably playing like a Ragavan on turn 1 is like your best threat. Ragavan easily takes over games. And look at this guy, he's adorable. Ragavan can easily take over a game. Once you protect it kind of and get in 1 or 2 hits, you end up making 2 treasure tokens, preferably hitting your 3rd land drop. So then you just have 5 mana up the whole rest of the game. You're able to play Murktide Regents and leave up like counter spells and removal spells and other sort of things like that on turn 3. You're also able to even just set up your next future turns by casting like cantrips like Expressive Iteration, even casting like Archmage's Charm and still getting to leave up cards like Counterspell. It's definitely amazing that like 1 or 2 hits with a Ragavan just kind of keeps snowballing and put your opponent behind the 8 ball and just keep trying to find multiple answers for your Ragavans and things like that. If they manage to answer the Ragavan, following it up with a Ledger Shredder is not the worst thing either. Obviously, the big play and what you would want to have happen is that you cast a Ledger Shredder on turn 2. Play Mishra's Bauble, that's your second spell. You get to loot with the Ledger Shredder. Get it out of range of some of your opponent's spells. Obviously, Unholy Heat is still pretty bad for the bird, especially if your opponent is somehow able to gain Delirium on turn 2. But if they're not and they just cast multiple spells on their turn 2, then you're able to connive again for like the Ledger Shredder. And as long as your opponent doesn't hit Delirium and they have access to Unholy Heat, they're not going to be able to deal with it. And you end up getting to a point where Ledger Shredder is going to grow bigger than Unholy Heats, and it is just going to be a massive flyer. That's going to be very hard for your opponents to deal with. So definitely getting to keep that in mind. Ragavan and Ledger Shredder are definitely your best friends. Dragon Rage Chandler is not a very bad backup plan, considering that you're just going to keep fueling the graveyard for future Murktide Regents, and you're going to get to the point in the game where you have enough mana available to where you're going to be able to play a Murktide Regent. Protect it with a counterspell, untap, hopefully with a little bit more permission, whether it's some number of like Spell Pierce, other counterspells, Archmage's Charms, and things like that. Clearing the path when Unholy Heats and Lightning Bolt and hitting your opponent with a giant dragon to then eventually just close out the game after all the little chipping and stuff that you did with like Ragavans, Ledger Shudders, and Dragon Rage Channeler. Definitely a way that you can end up screwing yourself playing this deck is just being overly aggressive with your spells. So if you try to say like Unholy Heat or Lightning Bolt, like a creature that really doesn't matter, you can end up getting got by some other creatures that obviously impact the board a little bit more. Maybe stunt like your Ragavan development of mana that way, or trying to get rid of like your opponent's Ledger Shredder and they cast a second spell, or they are able to cast like 2 spells and be able to grow their Ledger Shredder out of like Lightning Bolt range or Unholy Heat range. Definitely, this deck is a lot harder to play than it comes off as. I think that there is some matchups where you can just kind of cast spells at random, or as long as you have like turn 1 Ragavan, you're able to just get so far ahead and just like counter the cascade spells from the Rhinos deck or the Living End deck. But by and large, a lot of the matchups that you're going to play against, you're going to need to basically be able to think on your feet and also just maximize the one for ones that this deck can generate, because the one for ones that this deck can make are way bigger than most of the other decks, and that's kind of what the draw is. The floor for the deck is very low and the ceiling is pretty high. And the floor is pretty high and the ceiling is also very high. The floor is not low on this deck. All your cards are very good. Obviously, in the spell department, like Spell Pierce and Spell Snare, is a little more niche in that sense, but Unholy Heat being a removal spell for most of the format, Lightning Bolt being able to clean up some of the other stuff and go to the face, consider just getting you to see at least 2 cards just on its own. Archmage's Charm with all its modes and Expressive Iteration being one of the best cantrips that you have in the format, on top of just having Counterspell, which is the cheapest. Like, I'm going to hard answer any spell. Obviously, that doesn't have the text can't be countered staple to it. This deck is going to be very good, and as long as all these cards are legal, I still don't see why this card or why this deck would not be good for a very long time as well. So when playing the deck, definitely maximizing those one for ones, getting a threat down super early and protecting it, and not leaving yourself open to your opponent slamming a haymaker that can make it very hard for you to close out a game. And of course, playing your big dragon for super cheap, maximizing the amount of spells that you can get rid of, and then being able to protect it is definitely the keys to victory when playing this deck. Now, for playing against Murktide, you definitely want to be when you're playing the deck, you want to maximize the one for ones and make them as brutal as possible. You want to minimize the amount of brutality on their one for ones. Being playing like the Yawgmoth deck and stuff like that, when you have cards like Scavenging Ooze or ways to eat their graveyard, you definitely want to put them in a bad spot and never give them an opportunity to use their graveyard whenever possible. I remember a game in particular where I had an opponent where I knew that they had like cards like Unholy Heat and things like that, and I had a Scavenging Ooze in play. And the important thing that I did to like leverage it so that I would not lose the Scavenging Ooze is never leaving, or just basically leaving up green mana and not using all of it. Because while it does seem very mana inefficient to not use all your mana on a turn cycle, leaving and remembering how Unholy Heat, Delirium essentially like matters and stuff like that. If you cast an Unholy Heat and you have Delirium when you cast it, it's also checked when the spell resolves. So if your opponent has, say, one artifact in the graveyard and they go to cast an Unholy Heat on your guy, then you can just eat the Mishra's Bauble and it's only going to deal 2 damage instead of the 6 that it would have dealt if the Bauble was still there. So keeping that in mind, essentially in the scenario that I'm trying to present is when I was playing my opponent in like round 2 of a pretty big modern tournament, that was my plan, was to just eat whatever I could with what mana I had available, but always leaving up enough mana so that if they were to cast said removal spell, that they would have to essentially be able to re-trigger Delirium once all my mana was spent trying to get rid of it. So just some things to keep in mind. I know a lot of decks like to play Endurance as well. Being able to do the same thing, you can easily blank an Unholy Heat by doing that as well. Remembering exactly, um, basically remembering what this deck wants to do and what it wants to be. It's a tempo deck. You definitely don't want to give them the tempo. You want to keep their momentum to a minimum and just finding ways and finding holes and forcing them to make mistakes is how you're going to beat the Murktide deck. There's a reason why it is the most played deck, and it really is for the fact that the deck doesn't leave a lot of openings. It is a very tough deck to play, so a lot of the people that do play the deck and play it on a regular basis kind of have like the ins and outs and the ropes down for the most part, to where they are able to just, navigate around those situations and stuff. Really, it is kind of a mental chess match. You are trying to outplay the player. You kind of hope that if you are playing against a Murktide deck, you're playing against someone that is maybe unfamiliar with like a matchup or just new with the deck, because that is one of the easiest ways to honestly beat any kind of deck that has any sort of sizable metagame share. It's just hoping that they're new. If you're playing against like an experienced player, it's really just making them play into a situation to where they are going to make a mistake, or it's very hard for them to have an answer for everything. So That's my keys to remember when playing against the Murktide deck. And that's my overall breakdown and analysis of the blue-red Murktide deck for the modern format. I'm going to be doing this for some of the other top decks in the format. And maybe not sort of in the same style that I just presented it now. This is something I definitely wanted to get out because it's one of the most popular decks in the format. Modern season, to me at least, is coming up. Definitely a lot of tournaments coming towards the end of this year and the beginning of next year. So I want to be able to pump out videos like this and kind of show off some knowledge and things like that to help players that are maybe getting into the deck or trying to play against it and figuring out how they want to attack said matchups and stuff. So, yeah, I did a lot of rambling in this video, so my apologies, but I hope that this video was helpful, and of course, if you enjoyed it, please leave a like on the video, and of course, consider subscribing to the channel as well, to where you'll see more videos like this, going over modern Pioneer decks, and possibly even doing the same thing for the Pioneer format as well, and of course, some other videos which I do have in the works to hopefully start uploading next week, where there's a sense of normalcy in my life. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. Again, if you did, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot, and I hope to see you all in the next video.